The transport truck lurched over a pothole, and Greta Zimmermann's head struck the metal ribbing behind her. She didn't cry out. None of them did. The 18 women crammed into the canvas-covered bed of the American military vehicle had learned that silence was survival, that drawing attention meant risk, that invisibility was the only armor left to them now. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. It was April 1945, and the war had ended 3 weeks ago, though ended felt like the wrong word. Collapsed was better. Shattered. The Third Reich hadn't concluded so much as it had imploded, folding in on itself like a building demolished from within. Greta had been working as a communications officer in a bunker outside Munich when the Americans arrived. She'd expected bullets. She'd expected rage. She'd expected the kind of justice that came swift and final, the way her own country had dispensed it across a continent. Instead, they'd been processed, photographed, documented, and now they were being transported somewhere. Nobody would say where, while spring sunshine filtered through gaps in the truck's canvas, striping their faces with light that felt obscene in its cheerfulness. Beside Greta sat Helene Richter, who'd been a nurse in the Wehrmacht. Helene's hands were folded in her lap, the knuckles white, her fingernails bitten down to nothing. She was 24 but looked 40, her blonde hair gone dull and brittle, her eyes carrying that 1,000-yard stare Greta had seen in so many soldiers' faces. Across from them, Margaret Klein rocked slightly, humming something under her breath. A lullaby, maybe, or a hymn. Margaret had 3 children somewhere in the chaos of defeated Germany, and nobody knew if they were alive. The truck smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. Fear had a scent Greta had learned, metallic and sour, like copper pennies dissolved in vinegar. "Where do you think they're taking us?" whispered Anna Vogel, the youngest of them at 19. Anna had been a radio operator, recruited at 17 when the Reich was scraping the bottom of every barrel it could find. Her voice carried the tremor of someone expecting the worst and trying to prepare for it. "Does it matter?" Greta replied, not unkindly. She turned 31 last month? Or was it 2 months ago? Time had become elastic, unreliable. "Wherever it is, we're going." Through the gap in the canvas, Greta caught glimpses of the German countryside rolling past. Fields that should have been planted were lying fallow. Farmhouses stood with windows blown out, their roofs caved in. A church steeple rose against the blue sky, its cross missing, leaving only a jagged stump. Every few kilometers, they'd pass clusters of refugees trudging along the roadside. Old men, women, children pulling wagons loaded with whatever they'd managed to save. Nobody looked up at the American convoy. Everyone had learned to keep their heads down. The truck slowed, gears grinding, and then stopped completely. The engine died. In the sudden silence, Greta could hear birds singing. Skylarks, maybe, or thrushes. The absurdity of birdsong at a moment like this struck her as almost offensive. Didn't the birds know? Didn't they understand that the world had burned? Boots crunched on gravel outside. Male voices speaking English in accents Greta didn't recognize, not British, so American then. She'd studied English in gymnasium before the war, back when her biggest concern had been whether Klaus Hoffmann would ask her to dance at the summer festival. Klaus was dead now. Stalingrad, 1943. Half the boys she'd grown up with were dead. The canvas flap at the back of the truck flew open, flooding the space with afternoon light. The women squinted, shielding their eyes. A young American soldier stood there, maybe 22 or 23, with freckles across his nose and red hair visible beneath his helmet. He was smiling. That was the first shock. The smile. "Ladies," he said in thickly accented German. "Welcome to Camp Sheridan. Please carefully come down. We have food and water waiting." Nobody moved. The word food hung in the air like a question none of them trusted. The soldier's smile didn't fade. He extended his hand toward the nearest woman, Frau Weber, who was 56 and had been a schoolteacher before they'd put her in uniform and trained her to decode Soviet communications. Frau Weber stared at his hand as if it were a loaded weapon. "It's okay," the soldier said, maintaining his smile, his hand steady. Nobody's going to hurt you. I promise. Promises from soldiers. Greta had heard those before. She'd made them herself. But Frau Weber, after a long moment, took his hand. He helped her down from the truck bed with surprising gentleness, as if she were his grandmother descending from a church step. Then he turned back, hand extended again, still smiling. One by one they climbed down. Each time he offered his hand. Each time he smiled. Each time he said something kind in his broken German. Careful of the step, or take your time, or there you go, you're doing great. Greta was the seventh to descend. When his hand closed around hers, warm, calloused, steady, she felt something she couldn't name. Not quite trust. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of trust. The way you might feel the first warm breeze after a long winter and allow yourself to believe, just for a moment, that spring might actually come. Her feet touched the ground, and she looked around. They were in a compound surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. Sensible, they were prisoners, after all. But the barracks visible beyond the fence looked newly constructed, with real roofs and glass windows. Not the bombed-out ruins she'd expected. Not the muddy pits she'd heard the Red Army used for their prisoners. An older American soldier approached, this one with sergeant stripes on his sleeve and gray threading through his dark hair. He carried a clipboard and a canteen. When he reached them, he unscrewed the canteen and offered it to Frau Weber. "Drink," he said in German, even more broken than the young soldiers. "Clean. Safe." Frau Weber took the canteen like it might explode. She sniffed it, then took a tentative sip. Her eyes widened. She took another sip, longer this time, then another. The sergeant gently took it back before she could make herself sick and passed it to the next woman. They shared the canteen in silence, each woman drinking carefully, disbelieving. The water was cold, clean, with no chemical taste. After weeks of drinking whatever they could find, sometimes from puddles, once from a horse trough, this water tasted like a miracle. "My name is Sergeant O'Brien," the older soldier said, speaking slowly, clearly. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army. Geneva Convention applies. You will be treated with respect. You will receive food, shelter, medical care. You will not be harmed." Greta watched his face as he spoke. He meant it, or at least he seemed to mean it. But she'd learned not to trust what men said. She'd learned to watch their hands, their eyes, the tension in their shoulders. Those told the truth that words could hide. Sergeant O'Brien's hands were relaxed. His eyes moved from face to face without lingering in the way that meant hunger or cruelty. His shoulders carried authority but not aggression. Either he was the world's best liar, or he was telling the truth. "You'll be assigned to barracks," he continued. "For women per room. Beds with mattresses. Blankets. We'll bring dinner at 1800 hours, 6 o'clock. Tomorrow there will be a medical examination. Nobody will be forced to do anything. If you need anything, you tell the guards. They are here to help." Help. Another word that felt foreign. Suspicious. Help from the enemy. Help from the victors. Help from men whose friends they'd killed, whose cities they'd bombed, whose cause they'd opposed until the very end. The young red-haired soldier was organizing them into groups of 4. When he reached Greta, he smiled again. That same open, genuine smile, and said, "You'll be in Barak 7 with these 3 ladies." He gestured to Helene, Anna, and a woman named Sonia whom Greta barely knew. "Follow me, please," he said, and started walking toward one of the buildings. They followed because what else could they do? But Greta noticed things as they walked. The guards along the fence weren't pointing their rifles at anyone. They stood relaxed, some of them smoking cigarettes, one of them reading a letter from home. The compound was clean, no trash, no sewage, no bodies. Flower boxes sat beneath some of the windows, empty now but suggesting that someone had cared about beauty here, once. Barak 7 was at the end of a row. The red-haired soldier opened the door and stepped back, holding it like a doorman at a hotel. "Here you are. Make yourselves comfortable. Dinner will come soon." Inside, the room was small but clean. 4 beds, made up with white sheets and gray wool blankets. A table with 4 chairs. A window with actual glass. Curtains pulled back to let in the afternoon light. A small stove in the corner. On each bed lay a bundle. A towel, a bar of soap, and what looked like a change of clothes. Greta stood in the middle of the room, trying to process it. This wasn't a prison. It was better than her apartment in Munich before the war. It was better than anywhere she'd slept in the last 3 years. "Why?" she said aloud, not expecting an answer. But Anna answered anyway, her voice small and wondering. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this." Helene sat down on one of the beds, slowly, as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. She touched the blanket, running her fingers over the wool. "It's real," she whispered. "It's actually real." Sonia, who hadn't spoken since they'd been captured, walked to the window and looked out. "There are other women out there," she said. "Hundreds of them, walking around. No guards following them." Greta joined her at the window. It was true. Women in various states of Wehrmacht uniform or pieces of it were moving through the compound freely. Some were sitting on benches in the sun. Others were talking in small groups. One woman was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 barracks. Laundry, as if this were a normal day in a normal place. A knock at the door made them all jump. "Come in," Greta called, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened, and a different American soldier entered. This one older, maybe 50, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a cardboard box. "Good evening, ladies," he said in careful German. "I'm Corporal Davies. I brought you some things to start with." He set the box on the table and began unpacking it. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, combs, a small mirror, pencils and paper, a deck of cards, for tin cups, and at the bottom, wrapped in wax paper, for apples. Apples. Greta hadn't seen an apple in 2 years. "Dinner comes in about an hour," Corporal Davies said. "It's not fancy, chicken soup, bread, some vegetables, but it's hot and there's enough for everyone. If you have dietary restrictions or medical needs, let me know and we'll accommodate." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "I know this is confusing. I know you probably don't trust us. That's okay. Trust takes time. But we meant what Sergeant O'Brien said. You're under our protection now. That means something to us." He headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. "Oh, and one more thing. There's a chapel service on Sunday mornings, if you're interested. It's optional. Everything here is optional. But some of the women find it comforting." He touched his hand to his cap in a small salute and left, closing the door gently behind him. The 4 women stood in silence, staring at the box of supplies. Finally, Helene reached out and picked up one of the apples. She held it to her nose and breathed in deeply. "It smells like autumn," she said. "Like home. Before. That word carried everything. Before the war, before the Reich. Before they'd learned what humans could do to each other when ideology turned them into instruments of something larger and darker than themselves." Greta picked up one of the pencils and tested it against her palm. The tip was sharp. They'd been given sharp objects. Sharp objects meant trust, or at least the beginning of it. You didn't give prisoners weapons, even small ones, unless you believed they wouldn't use them. "I don't understand," Anna said again, sinking onto her bed. "Why are they being so kind? We were the enemy. We fought them. We killed their friends. Why aren't they?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she meant. "Why aren't they hurting us? Why aren't they starving us? Why aren't they doing to us what we did to others?" Greta sat down at the table, turning the pencil over in her fingers. Outside, the spring evening was settling in, the light going golden and soft. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of women laughing. Actually laughing. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected, that for a moment she wondered if she was hallucinating. "I don't know," Greta said finally. "But maybe we're about to find out what happens when the victors choose something different than revenge." The chicken soup arrived exactly at 6 o'clock, carried by 2 American soldiers who pushed a wheeled cart down the corridor, stopping at each room. When they reached Barack 7, one of them knocked and waited for permission before entering. This small courtesy, waiting, asking, struck Greta as remarkable. In the Wehrmacht, doors were opened without ceremony. Privacy was a luxury that rank afforded, and she'd had no rank worth mentioning. The soldier who entered was black, which startled Greta more than she wanted to admit. The Reich's propaganda had painted very specific pictures of American soldiers, none of them flattering, and black soldiers had been portrayed as especially dangerous. But this man, whose name tag read Johnson, smiled the same way the red-haired soldier had, with genuine warmth that reached his eyes. "Evening, ladies," he said in English, then added in halting German, "Dinner. Hot. Good." He ladled soup into their tin cups with care, making sure each serving was equal, then placed 4 thick slices of bread on the table, along with a small crock of butter. Real butter, yellow and soft. "Thank you," Greta said, the English words clumsy in her mouth. Corporal Johnson's smile widened. "You're welcome," he replied. "Enjoy." And then he was gone, moving on to the next room with his cart. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The 4 women sat around the table, staring at their food. The soup steamed gently, releasing the scent of chicken, carrots, potatoes, and something herbal, thyme, maybe, or rosemary. Greta's stomach cramped with hunger, but something held her back. Some instinct that said eating meant accepting, and accepting meant acknowledging that this wasn't a trick. It was Sonia who broke first. She lifted her cup and drank directly from it, not bothering with a spoon. She drank until the cup was empty, then set it down and closed her eyes. "Mein Gott," she whispered. "Mein Gott." That broke the spell. They ate. The soup was simple but rich, the bread dense and filling, the butter a luxury Greta had almost forgotten existed. No one spoke until the food was gone. When they finished, they sat in satisfied silence, the kind that comes after a need has been met that went so deep, words couldn't touch it. That first night, Greta barely slept. The bed was too soft, the sheets too clean, the blanket too warm. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the camp, women coughing in other barracks, guards changing shifts with quiet efficiency, the distant hum of a generator. At one point, she heard singing. A woman's voice, lovely and clear, singing Gutermond, "Du Gehst so still," a lullaby her own mother had sung to her 30 years ago. Greta turned her face into the pillow and cried as silently as she could manage. The next morning began with breakfast, porridge with brown sugar, weak coffee, and an orange. An orange. Greta held it in both hands like a sacred object. She'd been 9 years old the last time she'd had an orange, on Christmas morning before her father lost his shop in the Depression. After breakfast, they were called for medical examinations. This was what Greta had been dreading. Medical examinations could mean anything. She'd heard stories from the Eastern Front, whispered tales of what happened to women when armies decided they were spoils to be claimed. She'd seen the fear in Russian women's eyes when the Wehrmacht rolled through their villages. Now she was on the other side, and the stories felt different when you were living them. But the medical examination was exactly what it claimed to be. An American Army doctor, a woman in her 40s named Captain Martinez, examined each of them with professional efficiency and unexpected gentleness. She asked questions about their health history, documented old injuries, treated a respiratory infection Helene had been hiding, gave antivitamins for malnutrition. When she examined Greta, she noted the old bullet graze on her shoulder, a souvenir from an Allied bombing raid in '44, and asked if it still caused her pain. "Sometimes," Greta admitted. "I'll prescribe some aspirin. Take 2 in the morning if it bothers you." Captain Martinez made a note on her clipboard. "Any other concerns? Headaches? Stomach problems? Difficulty sleeping?" The kindness in her voice nearly undid Greta. "No," she managed. "Thank you." "You're welcome." Captain Martinez looked up from her clipboard, meeting Greta's eyes directly. "I know this is strange for you. I know you don't have any reason to trust us. But I want you to know that you're safe here. That's not propaganda. That's truth." After the examinations, they were given the rest of the day to settle in. Greta spent it exploring the compound, trying to understand this bizarre new reality. The camp held about 800 women, she estimated, all former Wehrmacht personnel, everything from communications officers to nurses to mechanics. They were segregated by rank to some extent, but the divisions seemed loose, informal. She met a woman named Frida Bauer who'd been a pilot, one of the few who'd flown reconnaissance missions in the early years of the war. Frida had a scar running down her left cheek from a crash landing in Poland. "I expected prison," Frida said as they sat together on a bench in the afternoon sun. "I expected punishment. Instead, they gave me a room with a window and 3 meals a day. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "Me too," Greta admitted. "But what if it doesn't?" Frida looked at her, squinting against the sun. "What if this is just how they do things?" That thought was somehow more frightening than the alternatives. If the Americans were cruel, Greta would understand. Cruelty made sense. Cruelty was logical in war, a tool, a weapon, a strategy. But kindness? Kindness suggested something else entirely. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, there had been another way all along and they'd simply chosen not to take it. In the evenings, after dinner, some of the women gathered in a common room in one of the larger barracks. Someone had a harmonica. Someone else had a battered book of German poetry. They took turns reading aloud Goethe, Schiller, Heine. The words felt different now, filtered through the lens of everything that had happened. When someone read Die Lorelei, that famous poem about the siren on the Rhine who lured sailors to their deaths with her singing, the room fell silent. They all understood the metaphor differently now. They'd all been the sailors, lured by promises of glory and greatness, steered onto the rocks of history. Greta's roommates began to reveal themselves slowly, like photographs developing in a darkroom. Helene had been a nurse in a field hospital outside Warsaw. She'd seen things that had emptied her out from the inside, leaving only a shell that walked and talked but didn't quite feel alive anymore. She mentioned a doctor she'd worked with, a man named Klaus Brenner, who'd refused to deny treatment to a wounded Russian soldier and been sent to the Eastern Front as punishment. She didn't know if he'd survived. Anna had grown up on a farm in Bavaria. Her father had died in the first year of the war, killed in France. Her 3 brothers had all enlisted. 2 were confirmed dead. The 3rd was missing, last seen retreating from the Soviets somewhere near Berlin. Anna carried a photograph of them all together. 5 children, 2 parents, everyone smiling in front of their farmhouse on a summer day that looked like it belonged to a different world. She kept the photo in her pocket and touched it constantly, like a talisman. Sonia revealed the least. She'd been a translator working in an administrative office. She didn't talk about what she'd translated, but Greta could guess. Orders, reports, communications between units engaged in operations that nobody wanted to examine too closely now. Sonia had a way of looking through people rather than at them, as if she'd learned to make herself invisible by simply refusing to fully inhabit her own presence. On the 3rd day, they were issued work assignments. Nothing strenuous. The Geneva Convention protected prisoners from forced labor, and the Americans seemed determined to follow every rule to the letter. Greta was assigned to the camp library, such as it was, a room with a few hundred books in various languages, most of them donated by the Red Cross. Her job was to organize them, keep them in order, and help other prisoners find reading material. It was there, shelving a German translation of A Tale of Two Cities, that she met Sergeant William Hayes. He was in his mid-30s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that suggested he'd seen more than he'd wanted to but had somehow maintained his humanity anyway. He was the soldier in charge of camp recreation and morale, which apparently included the library. "You speak English?" he asked when he found her examining a copy of The Great Gatsby with curiosity. "Some," Greta replied carefully. "I studied in gymnasium. Before." "Before," Hayes repeated, nodding. He understood what that word meant. "Well, if you need help with any of these, let me know. I'm happy to translate or find someone who can." He visited the library every few days after that, always with some excuse. Dropping off new books, checking on supplies, asking if anyone needed anything. But Greta began to suspect he came for the same reason she lingered there after her duties were done. It was quiet, peaceful, a space where you could pretend, just for an hour, that the world was normal. One afternoon, as rain drummed against the windows and Greta organized a shipment of books that had just arrived from the Red Cross, Hayes asked her the question she'd been dreading. "What did you do in the war?" Greta's hands stilled on the spine of a book, The Count of Monte Cristo, ironically enough, a story about unjust imprisonment and revenge. "I was a communications officer," she said carefully. "I relayed messages, managed radio equipment. Nothing important." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever wonder," he said slowly, "about the content of those messages?" And there it was, the question beneath the question. Did you know? Did you participate? Are you guilty of silence, complicity, or something worse? Greta set down the book and turned to face him. She owed him honesty, even if honesty damned her. "I wondered," she said, "but I didn't ask. And I didn't stop. I told myself I was just doing my job, that someone else would relay the messages if I didn't, that it wasn't my responsibility to question orders. I told myself a lot of things." Hayes nodded slowly. He didn't look angry or disgusted. He looked sad. "A lot of people told themselves a lot of things," he said quietly. "On both sides. That's how it works. That's how they get us to do things we'd never do otherwise. Does that make it forgivable?" Greta asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "I don't know," Hayes admitted. "I'm not a chaplain or a judge. I'm just a guy from Ohio who got drafted and ended up here. But I think maybe forgiveness isn't the point. Understanding is the point. Making sure it doesn't happen again is the point." After he left, Greta sat alone in the library for a long time, listening to the rain and thinking about understanding. Understanding meant looking at how it had happened, how a nation of poets and philosophers had become a machine of conquest and genocide. It meant examining the mechanisms of propaganda, the seduction of belonging to something larger than yourself, the way fear and pride could be weaponized. It meant accepting that ordinary people like her, had been the gears in that machine. A week into their captivity, Greta woke before dawn and couldn't fall back asleep. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake her roommates, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine from the forest beyond the camp's perimeter. Stars were fading into the growing light. She wasn't the only one awake. Several women were already moving through the compound, some on work detail, others simply unable to sleep, like her. Greta walked to the fence and stood there, watching the sky lighten in the east. A guard approached, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave. "Morning," he said in English, then added in careful German, "Beautiful sunrise." "Yes," Greta agreed. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the day arrive. After a few minutes, the guard pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and then, after a moment's hesitation, offered the pack to Greta. She stared at it. Sharing a cigarette with the enemy. No, not the enemy anymore. Just another human being watching the sun come up. She took one. He lit it for her, cupping his hands around the flame to protect it from the breeze. The tobacco was American, harsh and strong. Nothing like the cigarettes she'd smoked in Munich. But it was a gift freely given, and that made it taste like something more than tobacco. "My name's Danny," the guard said. "Danny Kowalski, from Chicago." "Greta Zimmermann," she replied. "From Munich." "Munich," Danny repeated. "Pretty city. Or it was, I guess, before the bombing." "Very pretty," Greta said quietly. "Once." They smoked in silence as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. In that moment, standing at the fence with a cigarette in her hand and the taste of American tobacco in her mouth, Greta felt something shift inside her. It wasn't forgiveness. She hadn't earned that and maybe never would. It wasn't absolution. It was something smaller and larger at the same time. The recognition that the war was truly over, and now they had to figure out what came next. "Thanks for the cigarette," she said, grinding out the stub with her heel. "Anytime," Danny replied with a small smile. "Welcome to America, I guess. Even if it's behind a fence." Greta walked back to Barack 7 as the camp came alive around her. Women emerging for breakfast, guards changing shifts. Another day beginning in this strange liminal space between war and whatever peace looked like. When she entered her room, she found Helene awake, sitting on her bed and staring at nothing. Couldn't sleep? Greta asked. Nightmares, Helene admitted. The same ones. Always the same ones. Greta sat down beside her, not touching. Helene didn't like to be touched, but close enough to offer presence. Tell me something good, she said. From before. Something you loved. Helene was quiet for a long time. Then she said, there was a cafe near the hospital where I trained. They made the best Apfelstrudel in all of Berlin. My mother and I would go there on Sunday afternoons. She'd order coffee and I'd order hot chocolate, and we'd share a slice of strudel and talk about everything and nothing. I remember how the afternoon light would come through the windows and make everything golden. I remember feeling so happy, so safe, like nothing bad could ever happen in a world where strudel was that good. When this is over, Greta said carefully, we should go there, if it's still standing. We'll order strudel and remember what happiness tastes like. If it's still standing, Helene repeated. If anything is still standing. But she smiled a little and that counted for something. The days developed a rhythm. Breakfast, work assignments, lunch, free time, dinner, evening gatherings. On Sundays, there was a church service led by an American chaplain who spoke decent German. Greta didn't consider herself religious. The war had complicated her relationship with God, or maybe revealed that the relationship had always been complicated. But she went anyway. There was something comforting about the ritual, the familiar prayers, the sense that maybe, somewhere beyond the blood and ash, there was still meaning to be found. One Sunday, the chaplain read from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They'd shown no mercy, and yet mercy was being shown to them. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. After the service, an older woman named Frau Metz approached Greta. She'd been a supply officer, responsible for logistics in an administrative capacity. She was 63, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen everything and forgiven nothing, including herself. I've been thinking, Frau Metz said without preamble, about what we owe them, the Americans. We owe them everything, Greta replied. Our lives, our dignity, our humanity. No, Frau Metz said sharply. We owe them truth. That's the only currency we have left. Truth about what we did, what we saw, what we allowed to happen. That's the only way any of this means anything. Greta considered this. Who would we tell? Who would listen? I don't know, Frau Metz admitted. But I think we have to try. Because if we don't, if we just accept their kindness and go on with our lives and never speak about how we got here, then we're complicit all over again. Just in a different way. That conversation stayed with Greta for days. Truth. She'd been trained to relay information, not to interpret it or question it. But maybe that was exactly the problem. Maybe silence was just another form of collaboration. She began writing. Nothing formal, just thoughts in a notebook that Corporal Davies had included in one of the supply boxes. She wrote about her childhood in Munich, about her father's bookshop and her mother's garden. She wrote about the day she joined the Wehrmacht, driven by a combination of patriotism and economic necessity. They'd needed the money, and service meant a salary. She wrote about the faces of the other women in the communications office, how they'd laughed together and complained about the food and shared cigarettes on breaks, just like any other group of coworkers anywhere. And she wrote about the moment she'd understood. It hadn't been a single revelation but a slow accumulation of small details that didn't add up. The trains that went east and never seemed to return. The reports of relocations and special actions that used language clearly designed to obscure rather than clarify. The whispered conversations that ended when she entered a room. The smell that sometimes drifted over certain towns, acrid and wrong. She'd understood, and she'd done nothing. That was her crime. Not what she'd done, but what she'd failed to do. The questions she hadn't asked. The orders she hadn't questioned. The silence she'd maintained because silence was safer, easier, less complicated. Writing it down didn't make it better, but it made it real, acknowledged, undeniable. In the summer of 1945, Greta Zimmermann sits in an American POW camp, forced to confront the full horror of what she helped enable. As a Wehrmacht communications officer, she told herself she was just a small cog, relaying messages, filing reports, asking no questions. But when American soldiers show film footage from the liberated concentration camps, her carefully constructed denial shatters. The skeletal bodies, the mountains of belongings, the survivors barely clinging to life. This is where her messages led. The trains she helped coordinate, the special actions she logged without question, the euphemisms she chose not to decode. Camp Sheridan becomes an unlikely classroom in moral reckoning. When Ilse Hartmann, a former concentration camp guard, arrives, the women must grapple with degrees of guilt and collective responsibility. Are soldiers different from executioners? Where does complicity begin? Through testimonial interviews, educational programs, and painful self-examination, Greta confronts her crucial failure, the moment in December 1943 when she understood exactly what those coded messages meant and relayed them anyway. Her crime wasn't ignorance, but knowledge paired with cowardice. The American soldiers, including Private Goldman, whose Jewish family perished in the camps, choose mercy over vengeance, humanity over hatred. They show the prisoners what they've forgotten, that treating people with dignity, even those who enabled atrocity, is how you prevent becoming what you fought against. Professor Whitmore teaches them that authoritarianism arrives incrementally, with popular support, offering simple solutions and demanding loyalty over conscience. The safeguard isn't institutional. It's cultural, living in citizens who value truth over comfort. Greta begins writing to a future generation, determined that her failure become their lesson. Evil isn't built by monsters, it's built by ordinary people making small compromises until those compromises aren't small anymore. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more explorations of history's difficult truths and the human capacity for both complicity and redemption.